Okay, we're going to pick up right where we left off, talking about force production of a muscle. Okay, so the number of cross bridges that are formed between actin and myosin myofilaments at any instant or moment in time indicates or dictates the force of production of that muscle, right? Which makes sense. The more actin myosin filaments that we have engaging in cross bridge cycling, the bigger amount of force we're going to have as an output, right? So if we only have 2 or 3 actin myosin cross-bridge cycling, you're only going to get a very minimal twitch, right? However, if we had, 5,000 comparatively engaging in cross-bridge cycling at one point in time, that power output of that muscle or those muscle fibers will be much greater. Remember, calcium and ATP are necessary for cross-bridge cycling with actin and myosin filaments, right? So calcium and ATP are our players. We need calcium in order to shift that tropomyosin strand out of the way, and we also need, in order for myosin to attach to actin, we also need ATP to engage, for myosin to grab onto actin, create the power stroke, and then also detach from the actin itself. Okay, so let's keep going on with force concepts here. We can increase muscle force in 2 ways, and those 2 ways are recruitment and summation. And we're going to go over each one individually. Okay, what is muscle recruitment? It's defined as our ability to recruit more motor units. So if we want to perform a 1 rep max, we need to recruit all of the available motor units that we could. Then we need to what's called summate them together. So these are going to work hand in hand together, recruitment and summation. Okay, so again, recruitment is the ability to pretty much gather all of the motor units at once to be able to engage in a muscular contraction. So our ability to recruit more motor units, and again, a motor unit is an alpha motor neuron, and all the muscle fiber it innervates. So if you look here, this motor neuron innervates all of these muscle fibers, all of those, right? Okay. So then we need to summate them. What is summation? Here we need to increase the rate at which each motor unit was firing. So now we have recruited all of them. So we're recruiting all these muscle fibers in a muscle belly in order for us to engage in muscular contraction. So we've recruited all the amount we can with the neuromuscular system, but now we need to summate them. That means we need to increase the rate at which each of those motor units is firing. If you increase that rate, you're going to be increasing the amount of calcium in the cytosol, which makes sense. We're increasing the amount of times the motor unit is firing, increasing the amount of times action potentials are going down. Then we're going to increase the amount of calcium within the cytosol. By doing so, you're going to increase the force being generated. Why is calcium equate to increase in force? Again, because the increase in calcium's a key player with attaching to the 3rd molecular unit of troponin, shifting those tropomyosin strands out of the way in order for myosin to grab onto actin to create that power stroke. The more calcium we have, then the more binding sites are going to be available for muscular contractions and power stroke. So that's how calcium is a key player. So you need to do both. We need to recruit as many motor units as possible, and then we need to summate them, which means increasing the rate at which they're firing, which increases the calcium concentration, which increases force. Okay, so let's talk about a tetanic contraction. If you increase the rate at which the stimulus is arriving so that you do not allow recovery, you will have what's called a tetanic contraction. Now that you have smoothed out the hump a little bit and are generating force in proportion to the calcium being released. Okay, so it's not so multiple twitches. Okay, so the ability to generate what's called a tetanic contraction, which is a smooth contraction, is determined by 2 factors. Okay, number 1, it's the muscle's ability to tolerate the increase in calcium concentration in the cytosol. And if the muscle can deal with it, then we can get a nice smooth contraction that will give us a good amount of force. Number 2, the muscle action potential cannot last as long as the twitch contraction. This means that the action potential has to be shorter than the mechanical response itself. Makes sense. The nervous system response has to be shorter than the actual carrying out of the muscular contraction steps. Okay, so here's a little diagram review of that. So we have a stimulus here, and then we have what's called the latent period, which I will define for you in just a second. And then we have the muscle twitch, which is a contraction, and we relax. But now we're summating them. So this is just a single twitch contraction here. But now we're increasing the rate, again, at which those motor units are firing. So the faster we have those motor units firing, do you see how these are becoming closer together? These twitches are becoming closer and closer together. And by time we can tolerate the amount of, a good amount of calcium within the cytosol, we're going to get a nice smooth contraction of the muscle fiber, right? Of the muscle as a whole. Okay, so let's define what a latent period is really quick for you. So here's the stimulus at A, but do you see that there's a little time lag in between the actual contraction and relaxation? That means there is. Okay, so what's called a latent period is defined as the time between the actual stimulation of the contraction and the actual movement of the resistance itself. So there is a slight delay between the stimulus of the contraction and then the actual muscle contraction itself, or the twitch itself. But then again, as we go along here, to get a nice smooth muscle contraction, let's say to lift a weight or to do something in some smooth manner as a muscle belly as a whole, we need to increase the rate at which we are firing those motor units. So we're summating them. And then if we add enough calcium into the cell and we summate enough, we're going to get a nice smooth contraction. Okay, here's just another version of that diagram, right? So we have tension, we have our stimulus, our twitches here, incomplete tetanus here, and then full, what's called a full nice smooth contraction, because you see now we are increasing or summating them multiple times, a lot more than we used to be. Okay, so here again is another diagram just to show you various formats of this, which will hopefully help you understand these concepts. You will see a twitch summation and then a tetanus of a motor unit, meaning again we are summating them, firing them more to increase the calcium concentration of the cell. A right here is representative of just a single twitch. B is the force resulting from the summation of two twitches, so two twitches put together. And then C is pretty much what's called unfused tetanus, so we're increasing the amount that motor unit is firing, but not to an extent of complete smooth contraction yet. And then D, we have a fused tetanus, where a nice smooth contraction where we have increased the frequency of the firing of that motor unit to a point of a nice smooth muscular contraction. Okay, that's where it looks like right there. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about mechanics to muscular contraction. We're going to talk about it a little bit at what happens when a muscle is at equilibrium length, when we stimulate it, when we stretch a muscle fiber, shorten a muscle fiber, and then when the concept of plyometric training. Okay, so let's talk about the mechanics to this muscle contraction. So if we were to take a muscle out of its attachments and place it here or right in front of you on the table, okay, it would, what would it do? It would form to what's called its equilibrium length, right? And if we were to stimulate that muscle at its equilibrium length, just sitting there, that muscle would generate X amount of force, right? It's going to give us some amount of force in the position, in the equilibrium length that it is. Now, though, we can do a series of manipulations to that muscle to see if we can alter the force that it gives. So if we stretch that muscle to a certain percentage above resting length and stimulate it again, we will be able to generate more force than when it was at an equilibrium length. So now we have X plus Y equals Z, and Z being the new force based off of a slight stretch. The resting force plus the new force equals the total force now. However, if we continue to stretch the muscle fiber beyond a critical point, the amount of force you can generate will decrease, will go down, right? Kind of what I said a little bit before. Why? This is because now you are disengaging those cross bridges. Those actin and myosin filaments are pulled too far apart to engage with one another. So again, slight stretch will be able to generate more force. However, if we stretch too far, we're going to disengage those cross bridges and force will also decrease. Now let's go the opposite way. If we take that same muscle from equilibrium length and do the opposite, meaning we shorten it, so we kind of squish it together. So picture that muscle on the table or whatever, and then squish it together, okay? We're going to have actin bands bumping into each other and overlapping. There will also be some confusion on where those cross bridges are and don't know where the active sites are. So we're going to have some overlapping of the actin and myosin and not being able to actually grab onto the active site properly. So now what we have is what's called muscular interference, and the amount of force will go down. And there's no exact number that is determined on how much stretch is appropriate, but it can vary day to day and person to person. Some studies out there are saying the 6 to 8% is optimum stretch length for engaging in increase in force for muscle fibers. Some say 12 to 15. So it can be a large range. So we're just going to say for those purposes, anywhere from 6 to 15% of an increase in stretch will generate more force. Okay, so this is actually the principle and the essence of plyometric training: stretch, contract, stretch, contract, stretch, contract, and so forth. So that's actually the basic concept of plyometric training. Okay, so let's look here in diagram form of what I just explained. So hopefully this might be a little bit easier for you to understand. Now we have a force or tension on the y-axis over here, and then the x-axis we have the percentage of sarcomere length. So you will be able to see at equilibrium, we have right here a decreased length where we are shortening it some, where we're squishing those myofibrils together. The amount of force decreases. Right, so we're squishing those together, and again, that's what we're creating, that muscular interference. We're taking that muscle belly and kind of shortening it and squishing it, and then trying to muscular contract. We're only going to get X amount of force here. Right, so we're at 100%, and then, or between 90 and 100%. And then we have our increased length, so we're starting to increase right here, a little above resting equilibrium length. We're going to have the biggest percentage, the biggest output, force output, but now we're stretching too far. We are disengaging those cross bridges, and the myosin cannot grab onto actin, so then what's going to happen to force? Drastically decrease. That makes sense. Think about when you pull a muscle or you stretch too far and then you try to contract that muscle, you're giving very minimal force at that point, which makes sense from a physiological perspective. It's because your actin and myosin myofilaments can't find one another. They can't attach to each other to create a power stroke, or very few do. That's why the force is drastically decreased. However, again, the opposite. Now we're squishing the muscle fiber together. Now do me a favor and flex your bicep all the way up, so your wrists are up almost towards your shoulders. Now try to flex it a little bit harder, getting to your shoulder. You're only producing X amount of force because you have shortened those muscle fibers where they're overlapping each other, versus if you stretch your muscle fibers a little bit further down and then try to pull your wrist back up, you're able to generate a lot more force with that contraction there. Okay, hopefully that made sense. All right, let's continue on with the neuromuscular system and the activation of various muscles and muscle fibers. So the extent of control of a muscle depends on the number of muscle fibers within each motor unit. So muscles that function with great precision are going to have as few as one muscle fiber per motor neuron. And muscles that require less precision have several hundred fibers served by one motor neuron. So that makes sense. Remember the all or none principle? Either all the muscle fibers are going to contract when a motor unit fires, or a alpha motor neuron fires, or it's not going to contract at all. So when one alpha motor neuron can innervate hundreds of muscle fibers, let's say in our gluteal muscles, because you don't need your gluteal muscles to do fine motor control. You don't need your gluteal muscles to type a report, to pick up a pencil, all those kind of things, right? You need your gluteal muscles to power you forward, to walk forward, to power you up the stairs. That's what, and for stability. So when those muscle fibers activate, one alpha motor neuron can fire, and many muscle fibers will act all at once in unison. Now let's go over here for an eye as an example. Now let's say you're looking to the right, you're looking up, you're looking down to the left, up to the left, and so forth, right? You need much more fine control to control the movement of your eyeballs, right? If you had one alpha motor neuron innervating hundreds of muscle fibers, you would have big gross movements of your eyes and very minimal control over your eyes then. So the less amount of muscle fibers one alpha motor neuron you have, the more motor control you have. So that same thing will go for digital manipulation. So think about you typing right here, writing your notes, writing a pen, and so forth. You need a lot more motor control in order for you to write a note or to type on your computer than you would, let's say, with your gluteal muscles. So one alpha motor neuron will innervate smaller amounts of muscle fibers. That way you have more control over the movement of those specific muscles. Okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about an innervation, what an innervation ratio is, and again, what we just kind of did for the glute versus the eye muscles. We'll define that in just a second. I will actually define what we just described. Okay, so to give you a definition of an innervation ratio, that is the ratio of the number of alpha motor neurons and the total number of skeletal muscle fibers in a single muscle. Okay, so it's the ratio between the number of alpha motor neurons and the total number of skeletal fibers in a muscle. This tells us the average number of fibers in what's called a muscle unit. So for example, 10,000 muscle fibers and 10 motor units. This will give us a ratio of 1 to 1,000. So meaning 1 alpha motor neuron for every 1,000 muscle fibers. The average number of muscle fibers per unit in that muscle is then 1,000. So this ratio will be much larger, again, like I just said, in the glute muscles and in our back, glute muscles and in our back muscles. And this ratio will be much smaller in muscles which require fine motor control, like the eye and the fingers, so digital manipulation. Okay, so the all or none principle, again, is all of the muscle fibers in a motor unit will contract and develop force at the same time. There's no evidence that motor unit stimulates a stimulus causes only some muscle fibers to contract in that unit, and similarly, a stronger action potential cannot produce a stronger contraction. It just means all of those muscle fibers within that motor unit will contract, or none of them will at all. That means the all or none principle. Okay, next we're going to review some muscle fiber types. Okay, so we have 3 major muscle types within our body, which is type 1, type 2A, and type 2B, or type 2X. You might see type 2B, type 2X are the same thing, depending on what information you're reading or what source you're reading. Okay, so you can see over here, we're going to go over here with type 1 muscle fibers. Do you see how it's rich in red? That's indicating myoglobin content and capillary blood supply to those muscles. So we're going to go over what type 1 muscle fibers are in just a second, but they are geared for long distance running, aerobic metabolism. Okay, they are geared for aerobic metabolism, meaning the use of oxygen. So things like walking, jogging, rowing, biking, we can do those tasks a lot longer than, let's say, sprinting. All right, I'll top over to the opposite side. We have large muscle fibers, white in color. So that means there is less myoglobin content and less blood flow to those, in the sense of, because this is using anaerobic metabolism, meaning without oxygen. So we don't have heavy myoglobin content within these muscle fibers. Okay, these muscle fibers are much larger in diameter, have large alpha motor neurons associated with them. They fire very quickly, but they also fatigue very quickly, where the type 1 muscle fibers are a little bit more fatigue resistant. Because we have the time to go through aerobic metabolism, produce more ATP per 1 fat or glucose molecule, that means we can exercise a lot longer using these muscle fibers. Anaerobic metabolism on the other side is where we are not using oxygen, and these muscle fibers do not need to go through aerobic metabolism, nor will they. They like to use the creatine phosphagen system as well as anaerobic glycolysis. So they will use creatine as well as stored ATP, creatine phosphate, as well as glucose in order for those to activate through anaerobic metabolism. So we can activate these quickly, generate a lot of force in a fast manner, but then we also fatigue quickly. So that's why we can't lift weights indefinitely. That's why we also can't sprint longer than we could jog. Okay, then our type 2A muscle fibers have characteristics of both, right? Where they have some more myoglobin content, they have some characteristics of aerobic fibers, as well as they have the ability to act quickly and in a faster manner, just like the type 2B. So those are kind of our middle of the road muscle fibers, aka for middle distance running. So we need to do a little bit of mix of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, and that's where the type 2A fibers come in. Okay, so let's review those quickly. Type 1 muscle fibers, again, are our postural muscles. So our gluteal muscles, our lower back muscles, our lumbar muscles, our intercostal muscles. They have high enzymatic activity. They are very resistant to fatigue, right? So that makes sense because you're sitting up against gravity. Your muscles are constantly contracting, working against gravity. Are you exhausted? No, you don't even notice it sometimes because, again, they are very resistant to fatigue using aerobic metabolism. They have high mitochondrial density because that's where aerobic metabolism takes place. Rich in capillary supply, right? Because we bring over blood flow in order to drop off the oxygen at the tissue levels and pick up waste. So we need really good blood supply to those muscles. They are very small in diameter and facilitate efficient gas exchange, and they are red in color due to the high myoglobin content. Okay, and myoglobin is that protein that is found in your muscle fibers, which is in high amounts within our skeletal muscle fibers. And the function, of course, is to supply oxygen to the cells of your muscles, our myocytes, okay, in order for us to engage in aerobic metabolism. So we are rich with myoglobin content. Okay, type 2A fibers are those mid-distance fibers, i.e. our calf muscles. So they primarily use oxidative processes, but also can function non-oxidatively. Like I said, they have characteristics of both. It's a mixed muscle belly with various muscle fibers. They're moderately resistant to fatigue. They're not as fatigue resistant as type 1. They do have a good amount of mitochondria, and they have moderate amounts of glycogen stored within their muscle fibers in case they need to engage in anaerobic metabolism, aka like sprinting or lifting a weight. Now, type 2B or type 2X fibers are fast glycolytic fibers. Now, they are mixed within our limb muscles and mostly within our flexors. Okay, so these rely again on non-oxidative glycolysis or anaerobic metabolism, meaning without oxygen. Again, over here, it's kind of more of a white muscle. We're not rich in myoglobin and capillary supply here, where we are over here. They have a very high glycolytic capacity. So you're going to see high amounts of the anaerobic glycolytic pathway enzymes being present within these muscle fibers. Very few mitochondria are within these muscle fiber cells. Why? Because mitochondria is where aerobic metabolism takes place, and these muscle fibers really only engage in anaerobic metabolism. Small amounts of myoglobin make sense for the same reason I just explained, and they're much whiter in color, larger in diameter, and large alpha motor neurons associated with them. Okay. What is non-oxidative glycolysis advantageous for? I want you to start thinking about that. What would non-oxidative glycolysis be advantageous for? All right, so think of some activities. We've already said them a little bit more. Plyometric training, sprinting, being able to lift weights, quick ballistic type movements, right, is what's going to be important. The duration of those type 2B muscle fibers in order for you to exercise is limited by the glycogen stores. The more glycogen you have stored, the more glycogen molecules you can access in order to break it down into a glucose 6-phosphate, bring it down to the anaerobic chain, and use the glucose molecule or glycogen molecule to produce very quick amounts of ATP. Okay. Okay, so again, let's go over type 1 fibers. What are those muscle fibers good for? What about type 2B and type 2A? So type 1 fibers, again, would be long distance running, cycling, jogging, walking, and so forth. All aerobic metabolism, resistant to fatigue muscle fibers. Type 2B, sprinting, plyometric training, lifting weights, quick ballistic movements where something requires a great amount of force. And type 2A, again, mid-distance running, and so forth, okay? All right, let's review the size order principle here. What is the size order principle? That means we are going to recruit from smallest motor unit to largest. That's what that means, okay? So right here, we have our type 1 muscle fibers and then our type 2Bs over here. So the amount of force being produced is going to be determined upon what muscle fibers we're activating. So obviously the amount of we need to recruit these higher order motor units in order to produce a lot of force. You could see it's in the 1 to 5 rep range. Now, if we're just lifting, say, a pencil, low loads, low intensities, I'm not going to activate my type 2B muscle fibers, which is going to cause a great deal of fatigue. We are going to save those for something if I need to lift a very heavy box out of the way, or shift something out of the way, right? Or lift a heavy weight, or move something, or sprint very quickly. We want to save those. Right? Our body is always going to follow the path of least resistance. In physiology and anything, our human body is designed to preserve energy, conserve energy, as well as find the path of least resistance, because we need to save certain stores and certain energy in case, for example, we need to sprint out of the way. We need to lift something heavy out of the way. We need to do something very quickly that is actually a threat to our existence. So our bodies are always geared physiological to survive, and to do that, it's going to find the path of least resistance. So we're always going to activate our type 1 muscle fibers first. No matter what, low loads, low intensities, we're going to engage these muscle fibers first. as we increase force production, we're going to need to call upon our larger motor units to increase force output. Now, as we need to drastically increase force, we're now going to recruit those type 2Bs, okay? And when we get into a little bit of muscle adaptations, muscular hypertrophy and strength and all what goes into that, right? The muscle fiber types that respond most to muscular strength and hypertrophy are our type 2Bs. So that's why you typically have to lift heavy weights or sprint really fast or engage in plyometric training to see some sort of muscular adaptations. Okay. Again, size order principle, amount of tension, and the amount of time and what is being activated. So motor unit 1, small muscle fibers, small amount of tension here. We increase the amount of tension, we're going to activate those type 2Bs, those medium muscle fiber types. Now we're drastically increasing the tension. We need to get those type 2A fibers here and type 2B fibers up here because we need to engage in a lot of force. Okay, so this is what I just said in a chart form. Type 2X, which are our type 2Bs, we have our fast twitch fibers. Diameter of speed is large. The speed of action and relaxation is extremely fast. The force capacity is high output, and the rate of fatigue is also very quickly. Let's go to the opposite muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers, very slow in diameter, slow speed of relaxation, and slow force capacity, and rate of fatigue is slow, meaning we can continue on with aerobic exercise and using these muscle fibers for a much longer time than type 2Bs. Type 2As are considered our mid-distance muscle fibers, but are considered more so a little bit fast twitch, but they're intermediate size. They are fast to activate, intermediate force capacity, and their fatigue quicker than type 1s, but not as quick as type 2Bs. Okay, here's some other major characteristics of muscle fiber types. The motor neuron size with type 1, type 2A, type 2B, type 2X, or whatever. So please go down this characteristic list and you will then see over here the type 2As and type 1s, type 2Bs, what collates with what, right? So this is a great chart for you guys to review. So I'm going to have you review this, right? The fatigue resistant is high here. However, it's low with type B. Power output is low with type 1, but it's high with type 2Bs. The aerobic enzyme content is very high with type 1s and low with type Bs. This chart right here is going to give you all of the information you really need on the differences, physiological differences of type 1, type 2A, and type 2B muscle fibers. Okay, motor unit recruitment patterns during exercise. Let's talk about exercise for just a little bit. The force output of a muscle can be varied through two things. One, the change of frequency of activation of individual motor units, so we can increase the rate of firing or the speed of firing. Or two, we can change the number of activated motor units. We can recruit more motor units. So there's two different things we can do to increase force output. Change the frequency of activation, meaning we're going to increase the amount of calcium in the cytosol to engage in more muscular contractions quicker and faster and smooth out a tetanic contraction, or we can change the number of activated motor units. We can recruit more motor units in order to increase force output. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about a little bit about proprioceptors and the muscle spindles and what those entail and what those are. Okay, so proprioceptors are specialized sensory receptors that provide the central nervous system with information needed to maintain muscle tone and perform complex coordinated movements. So these are kind of our sensory type of receptors that are going to provide information back to us saying what we need to do to maintain our upright posture, exercise, and so forth, and our movement through space and time. Muscle spindles, when a muscle is stretched, deformation of the muscle spindle will occur and will activate the sensory neuron, which sends an impulse to the spinal cord, where the synapses are, causing the muscle to contract. Okay, so we have all these sensory type of neurons keeping us in check, so to speak. So let's continue on with proprioception. When a muscle is stretched, deformation of that muscle spindle activates a sensory neuron, which then sends an impulse to the spinal cord where the synapses with the motor neuron are, causing that muscle to contract. Okay, so let's see that happen. Sometimes we can be called a reflex arc here. But let's say the sensory neuron here, we stretch the muscle fiber. The sensory neuron sends a signal up here to the muscle spindles. The muscle spindle makes a decision quickly and activates a motor neuron and causes us to contract very quickly. Okay. Golgi, continuing on with the concept of proprioception, what are Golgi tendon organs? Those are the Golgi tendon organs are proprioceptors located in the tendons near our myotendinous junction. So where the muscle meets the tendon, right here. So this is a tendon, where's the muscle? They like to sit randomly right here. They occur in a series attached end to end with the what's called extrafusal muscle fibers. So those are detect changes within the with the junction at the muscle fiber as well with the tendon. When an extremely heavy load is placed on the muscle, the discharge of the Golgi tendon organ occurs. Why? The sensory neuron of the Golgi tendon organ activates an inhibitory interneuron in the spinal cord, which then turns synapses and inhibits a motor neuron serving the same muscle. So it's going to cause us to relax. Okay, so Golgi neurons is going to do the opposite, where we're going to stretch it too much, sends a sensory neuron, and it's going to send an information to the opposite muscle group of muscle fibers in order for it to relax. Okay, so how can athletes improve force production? We can incorporate phases of training that use heavier loads in order to optimize neural recruitment. So remember, the more motor units we recruit, the larger amount of force we'll be able to produce. As well as if we increase the firing rate of those motor units, we will also be able to increase the force due to the increased calcium content being put into the cell. We can increase the cross-sectional area of muscles involved in the desired activity. We can perform multi-muscle, multi-joint exercises that can be done with more explosive actions to optimize fast twitch muscle recruitment. All right, again, this is very introductory to the entire rest of the semester where we're going to dive into this a little bit more. Okay, and then next we are going to head into a review of the cardiovascular system. So that's a little bit of a review of the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the neuromuscular system. Again, we could spend all semester just talking about the nervous system, action potentials, muscle fibers, and all of this. But this is just a quick review, hopefully for you, regarding action potentials, how muscles are activated, and how we can increase the amount of force and the differences of muscle fiber types. Because once we get into a little bit more of training and principles of strength and conditioning, a little bit later on, you will be able to understand that from a greater extent. Okay, so head on over to the review of a quick review of the cardiovascular system next.